Hi, I'm Carolina from Always Expect More, and I wanted to show you how to use a seam ripper. Now, I have here two different seam rippers. They look fairly similar, except that this one here is tiny. You often get a little seam ripper like this in sewing kits or with your sewing machine, and they're great for when you're in a pinch, but this is not a seam ripper that I would use for serious seam ripping. And since I do some serious sewing, I end up doing some serious seam ripping. I have this seam ripper, which I much prefer. It's much bigger, it fits in my hand, it's contoured so I can fit my thumb right there, and it's much more comfortable in my hand. So if you're doing a lot of seam ripping, I would highly recommend you get a seam ripper with a good handle on it that is much more comfortable and gives you some grip instead of trying to rip a ton of seams with this tiny little thing that you can barely fit between two fingers, and it's not nearly as nice as a good quality seam ripper. Okay, so I have just a piece of scrap fabric that I've done some stitches on to show you a couple different ways that you can rip seams. Now, the first way that a lot of people rip seams is they just open up the seam a little bit, and you put the seam ripper right in, and you get underneath some of your threads, and you just rip that seam. And you don't want the point to do the work. The blade is actually right here at the bottom of the seam ripper, and that's what'll do your cutting. So you don't want, when you're putting your seam ripper in, to be pulling like this here, because that's not going to do any good. You want to be pushing to the end and letting that blade do all your cutting for you. Just like that. Isn't that nice? And that way you get rid of a seam in a place that you clearly didn't want to have it. Okay, so that is how you rip a seam. And you can see I'm giving the fabric a slight pull. I'm not yanking on it. I don't want to distort the fabric or stretch the fabric in any way. I just want to pull some of those seams out and pull some of the stitches out and open up the seam. So once we've done that, we have all these little threads, and we just need to go through and pick out our threads. I put my stitches in with some bright orange and red thread so that you could see what I was pulling, and we've got threads on the back as well. So we want to get all those threads out, because when we go back and re-stitch the seam that we pulled, and we stitch it correctly, we don't want all those little threads to get in the way of our seam and poke out of our good seam. Now, the other way that you can rip a seam is just by going on one side and taking your seam ripper, and if you look, it's flat. So we can put it flat through our stitch line, and just every 3 or 4 stitches, just cut a stitch. Every 3 or 4 stitches. This puts less overall tension on the fabric. If you actually go every 2 stitches, then you'll put a whole lot less tension on the fabric. This is good for if you've got a really open weave on your fabric, so any stretching is going to distort the fabric. And then, easy peasy, it just tears right open. And then again, you need to go through and pull all your threads. And the nice thing about doing it that way also is that you saw I pulled this one long thread because I'd only cut the stitches on one side of the fabric, which meant that the stitches on the other side, or the thread on the other side of the fabric, was whole, so that just pulls right off. And there you have it, 2 different ways that you can rip a seam.